Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this UEA Lasdun Lecture, and thank you very much for coming. We're so pleased to be back in London for the first time in 2 years, and particularly excited to be in a venue as beautiful as the Royal Institution. My name is Fiona Lettis, and I'm Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation at UEA. I'm delighted to see so many alumni and friends of the university here this evening. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to make a very small request of you all. We'll be sending out a brief survey via email in the coming days, canvassing your views on tonight's event. It would be very much helpful to us if you could tell us what you think so that we can plan our future lectures accordingly. Before we get to the main event, I'd like to give you a brief update on some recent happenings at UEA. The Research Excellence Framework, or REF as we like to call it, took place in 2021. It's a periodic assessment of research of all UK universities. It takes place about every 6 to 7 years, and it classified 91% of UEA's research as world-leading or internationally excellent, against a national average of 84%. This result puts UEA in the top 20 UK universities in the Times Higher Education's overall ranking table for the first time. We also rose to 16th place from 32nd in 2014 for the impact our research has on policy and practice across many different sectors, and that's regionally, nationally, and globally. It's a terrific achievement and testament to my amazing and talented colleagues from across UEA. A partnership between UEA mental health charity Mind and the Climate Psychology Alliance is addressing climate anxiety in young people. In collaboration with mental health charity Norfolk and Waveney Mind, UEA students have developed a programme that aims to give young people the skills to manage their rising anxiety and help end the taboo around climate anxiety. The Sustain project wants to turn the ecological anxiety prevalent in young people into positive action by hosting awareness events to normalise concerns, as well as monthly climate cafe drop-ins co-facilitated by UEA students, where feelings and strategies can be shared. And now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Caroline Elton. Caroline is an occupational and counselling psychologist who's worked in medical education for over 20 years. In 2018, her book, Also Human, The Inner Lives of Doctors, was published by Penguin Random House in the UK and by Basic Books in the US. In February of this year, she was appointed as Associate Professor and Senior Advisor at Norwich Medical School, a part-time role which she is combining with writing a memoir, also to be published by Penguin, of her late brother who was autistic and who died in January 2020. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caroline Elton.
Many thanks, Fiona, for that kind introduction. Tonight, we're going to hear from 3 UEA academics exploring the medical and health humanities in their research. After we hear from 3 different approaches to this emerging field, we'll open the floor both to those of you who are joining online and also, of course, to those who are with us in person at the Royal Institution. Before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say a few words about the different ways in which the fields of healthcare and the humanities might speak to each other. Art, stories, and drama yield new ways of understanding ourselves, our health, and our well-being. During this slice of living history now, at the moment, in which we're living and trying to learn lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, we have an extraordinary opportunity to radically rethink both the role of the humanities within healthcare and also the role of the humanities in helping us understand health and care themselves. What is health? What does it mean to have time and space to care in the contemporary landscape of health? Who is deemed healthy? Who is able to access health? How indeed do cultural narratives about health, illness, and disability shape this access? By better understanding the intersections and dissonances between patients' lived experience of illness and wider cultural narratives of health, illness, and disability, we can work towards improved clinical outcomes and policies and practices that put the patient at the centre of care. At UEA, we have a number of academics working at this fascinating intersection of health and the humanities. Tonight, we will hear from just 3 of them. But our Lasdun Lecture is a sneak preview, you didn't know this, of an exciting new development for UEA. We're developing an MA program in medical and health humanities. We'll be formally launching this in due course, but please do get in touch with us if you're interested in the program. So now, to introduce our speakers for tonight. Christy Watson is an award-winning, best-selling writer of fiction and non-fiction and is Professor of Medical and Health Humanities at UEA. The Language of Kindness, published in 2018, was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller and Book of the Year in the Evening Standard, Guardian, New Statesman, the Sunday Times, and the Times. It's been translated into 23 languages and also adapted for theatre. The intersection of health and humanities is central to her work and her latest non-fiction, which is Quilt on Fire, and that's going to be released on June the 16th, so look out for that. Christy.
Thank you, Caroline. Can you hear me? Yeah. A dear friend of mine was diagnosed with incurable cancer. And the doctor who gave her the diagnosis sat some distance away from her. And knowing that she was a professor and good at numbers, he ran through lots of statistics about survival, and he gave her all the data from the clinical trials and talked about her scan results, biopsy results, palliative care treatment plans. And he used a very, very medical language with her that she really didn't understand at that time. She was stunned, and she said to me that for all the painful treatments and surgeries that she'd endured over the years, that was truly the most traumatic experience that she'd ever had. She told that doctor that he better hold her hand when he gives news like that, and he better ask about her family, and he better listen to her story. And I've thought so much about her experience and tried to reflect on it. And I've worked with so many doctors and nurses and allied healthcare professionals over the years who are expert at giving bad news, but not all. And so much of being a nurse and a doctor is actually not about fixing people. Quite often, actually, we can't fix people. Ultimately, we can't fix anyone. But it's always, always about trying to understand them. Narrative medicine is described by Columbia University as an interdisciplinary field that brings powerful narrative skills of radical listening and creativity from the humanities and the arts to address the needs of all who seek and deliver healthcare. It was first described in the year 2000 by Rita Charon, who described it as the capacity to recognize, absorb, metabolize, interpret, and be moved by stories of illness. Stories. Narrative medicine and medical humanities and health humanities, these are all actually different subjects, but they've got lots of crossover. And at the heart of all of them is story. And medicine and nursing and allied healthcare professionals have always been about story, because these professions are science and art in equal measure. But historically, because of technology that we didn't have, that we do have now, the training of clinicians has focused almost entirely on science. This has changed, and it's changing even more rapidly with this emerging field that we're talking about this evening. The New York Times reported that 80% of medical schools in America now teach narrative medicine. 80%. At Columbia, incoming medical students are required to complete a 6-week narrative medicine course with offerings in fiction writing and visual art. At Harvard, medical students are offered dance modules, which makes me afraid. I'm not sure about any of you. At Yale, future doctors are required to study paintings. There's a very good reason for all of this. And other universities, both in the UK and in the US, are adopting this idea, this notion of narrative medicine as being central
to healthcare and being urgent. UEA is, of course, committed to medical and health humanities and already doing lots of great work with research and teaching. And as Caroline mentioned, we have this new MA in medical and health humanities coming very soon. Watch this space. For which I'm delighted to be teaching a component of narrative medicine on, because I think it's so, so important, and it's so urgent, and it's so timely for both patients and staff. We need this. I was speaking to a colleague recently, a consultant, who always used to call narrative medicine a woo-woo subject. He's a great friend of mine, and we argue a lot. But he always used to say, how's your woo-woo subject? And he said there's no space in medical curriculum for what he considered soft skills, only what he termed hard science. He has changed his mind. He suffered a lot of burnout and mental health issues over the pandemic, like we all did. But he's finding it increasingly difficult to support his junior colleagues with the reality that they're facing. He now considers that soft skills are the hard skills of medicine, which I totally agree with. And there's lots of nods here as well. We talked about the National Health Service becoming the National Illness Service, and now perhaps it's the National Suffering Service. And the nature of human suffering has changed beyond belief, and we don't quite understand it yet. He talked about the training of doctors and how we used to recruit medical students based on how well they retained vast amounts of information. And really, now he feels we should be recruiting them based on how well they understand empathy, how well they understand that the soft skills are the hard skills of medicine, how well they interrogate, both critically and creatively, the vast amounts of often conflicting data that are available at our fingertips. I talked about narrative medicine, my woo-woo subject, and I told him that there's growing evidence that this increases empathy. Teaching narrative medicine increases empathy, it increases teamwork, it builds that awful word resilience, it improves mental well-being, and ultimately it improves patients' experience. I said that I believe very deeply that a really good understanding of story is as valuable to a future doctor as an A-level in chemistry. At which point he told me I was being ridiculous. But, you know, we can't agree about everything. But we did agree, both of us, that in order to alleviate suffering, you need to understand suffering. And the way to understand suffering is through the arts and humanities as well as the sciences. Sorry, I'm just going to wait. It's normally me doing that, so don't worry. But yeah, the way to alleviate suffering is through the arts and humanities as well as the sciences. That's how we understand suffering. And he agreed with me. Of course, he was talking about his patient's suffering, and I was thinking about his. But in any case, it felt like a step in the right direction, because this is a time of suffering. And obviously, the last few years have been suffering to different degrees for many different people. But I feel like it's been a time of dehumanization as well. And like many former healthcare professionals working clinically, I went back to clinical work for a short time during the peak of the pandemic. And even though I'd been a nurse for 20 years before that, and smelled and touched and heard and saw everything that nurses see, I'd never experienced anything so terrifying as COVID intensive care. And I've reflected a lot about why that was, what was so terrifying about it. And I think it was about how dehumanizing it felt. The patients were prone, that is, they were lying face down, and there were no visiting relatives to give us those details that make us who we are, our histories, our loves, our passions, our work, our joys, our tragedies. And the nurses and doctors and team were all obviously covered in PPE. And so they had masks on. The alarms were very loud. We couldn't hear, we couldn't see. There were no faces, there were no voices of either staff or patients. And that made it very, very difficult to communicate, but also to feel like it was a human space, that we were human beings. And the nurses and doctors, they cared for the patients as best they could with, at that time, a very unpredictable disease. But they actually went further than that. They contacted the relatives and found out the patients' stories. And they posted photographs behind the beds of people who were hooked up to machinery. And those people were no longer just statistics or somebody that we didn't know or recognize. A photograph of a man playing golf smiling, a card from a grandchild next to his bed, the Rolling Stones playing in his earphones because his daughter said that was what he liked to listen to. And these creative acts that the team did that were all about narrative, they helped the patients, they really helped the relatives, but most of all, I think they helped the staff. Because if COVID taught us anything, it taught us this. There is no us and them. There is us and us. We will all, every single one of us, face terrible news at some point in our lives. We will all get sick. And every single one of us will want a clinician who is able to humanize healthcare, who is an expert in story as well as science. I'm going to leave you with the wisdom of Oliver Sacks, who truly understood the value of narrative medicine, both in his medical practice as a doctor and his own experience of illness as a man. He said, in examining disease, we gain wisdom about anatomy and physiology and biology. In examining the person with disease, we gain wisdom about life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions both in the room and online. And Harriet, we're very keen to hear what you have to say as well.
Okay. I'm just going to launch straight in because I'm going to start with a story myself. When I was diagnosed with a mild physical impairment in early childhood, my diagnosis was accompanied by a prognostic statement delivered by a consultant which came to dominate the family culture surrounding my disability. The prognosis, as it was recounted to me, went like this. Harriet might never learn to swim, might never ride a bike, might never play a musical instrument. Perhaps the original pronouncement was softer, winding, prefaced, caveated. But this is the form it came to take in my mind. This was how it was mediated to me. For the child of a middle-class academic family in the early 1980s, it came to function like a sentence that had to be overturned. Every effort was made to make sure that I would do those things mentioned by the consultant, those particular things. Ride a bike, learn to swim, play a musical instrument. So how does a prognostic statement of this kind, presumably uttered quite quickly by a busy paediatrician with other sicker children to go and see, come to take on such force within the culture of a family? How does it get embedded within the fabric of stories that a family tells itself and tells about itself? It's in and through this primal scene of prognosis that I've journeyed with and arrived at the intersection of medicine and the humanities. I'm fascinated by the clinical encounter as a site of emotionally charged interaction in which meaning emerges, in which a narrative can take hold or be reshaped. What contextual factors give the words of the consultant the power to turn a brief prognostic utterance into a narrative that gives disability a particular shape and force within the life of a family? Moreover, does it matter how illness and disability are portrayed in literature, in the media, in popular culture? Does this make a difference to the narratives that emerge in the clinic? These are some of the many questions that the medical and health humanities allow us to open up. So for the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on why and how the portrayal of disability matters. There are hundreds of examples I could choose to discuss of disabled bodies in contemporary culture. The very act of choosing what we focus on is important. In the choosing of an object for discussion, I'm eliciting your attention. I'm asking it to rest upon something. I'm reinforcing, or perhaps attempting to subvert, an existing set of cultural relations that produce a canon of literature or a canon of art. So one of the things that critical disability studies does is to ask us to reflect on what we look at and how we look. It asks us, moreover, to look at the very processes of looking and seeing as acts that not everyone is able to share in, but acts that nonetheless permeate culture and structure thought. So as the disability theorist Amy Vidali has discussed, metaphors of vision are often used to convey the acquisition of knowledge. We say, I see, when we mean I know. We say, do you see what I mean? And we hardly notice the role of this kind of language and the role it plays in privileging vision and the eye and seeing and the gaze, how it privileges the gaze in our society. So in a moment, I'm going to invite you to explore with me a giant 7-meter-high sculpture of a disabled figure by one of the most famous artists in the world, the artist Damien Hirst. My choice is perhaps controversial. It has the potential to reinforce an existing set of cultural relations in which Hirst occupies a highly visible and privileged position as a wealthy and successful white male artist. This makes me uncomfortable in selecting this object for further attention, as does a question mark over what Hirst's claim on disability might be or might not be. As far as I know, Hirst does not identify as a disabled artist, but he nonetheless chose to portray disability in this sculpture. This object interests me because its critical reception helps us to trace a changing recent history of speaking about disability. So, to briefly describe this image, the sculpture represents one of the charity collection dolls that stood outside pharmacies and shops through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Hirst's sculpture is based on the one used by the charity Scope, formerly the Spastic Society, which works primarily with people with cerebral palsy, the impairment I have. Hirst's sculpture, a giant replica of the original doll, wears a caliper on her leg and holds a collection box and a teddy in her arms. The collection box, in Hirst's interpretation, has been vandalized as there are coins all over the ground. The doll's crutch also lies on the ground. So the historical charity dolls were removed during the 1980s. It was recognized that they were offensive to disabled people because they invite people to look at us as beggars, as objects of charity and pity. Hirst's revival of the charity collection doll in this giant 7-meter-high sculpture was originally displayed in 2003 in the park outside the White Q Gallery in Hoxton Square, London, as part of Hirst's first solo exhibition there. It was later displayed next to the Gherkin as part of a Sculpture in the City exhibition in 2015, and that's the website where these images are displayed. So, we have 4 historical reference points for looking at the charity collection box. The mid-20th century, when they were in use, the late 20th century, when they were removed, 2003, the year when Hirst's sculpture was first displayed, and 2015, when it was re-erected in the City of London. Before closing, I will briefly share some observations about the reception of Hirst's sculpture in each moment, because interestingly, it was between these two dates, 2003 and 2015, that we saw the flourishing of cultural disability studies in the UK in particular, which gave a platform to disabled people to speak about and speak back to those who chose to portray them. So in terms of the 2003 exhibition, it's hard to know how the exhibit was received by the disability community. There are no real responses recorded online from disabled people at that time. The artist and disability activist Jill Crawshaw suggests that Scope hadn't wanted Hirst to make the work. There were also some responses by art critics in 2003. But the question of who gets to speak about disability is basically absent in this early 2000s writing. There's no real reflexivity about who speaks about disability and how. Critical disability studies in the 2010s has helped us to explore how to position ourselves in relation to different embodied experiences. When the sculpture was displayed much later in 2015, there was a much more forceful pushback from the disability community. This led eventually to an exhibition of responses to Hirst's piece called Piss on Pity and curated by Jill Crawshaw. Activists discussed the very particular offence associated with displaying Hirst's pity-invoking representation of the disabled body next to one of the most iconic buildings in the City of London, the Gherkin, a site which is synonymous with the financial crash of 2008 that led to the UK government austerity programme. And the programme, as I'm sure you know, had overseen cuts to disabled people's benefits, so it was particularly upsetting for people to see this huge sculpture right in front of the Gherkin. In 2015, activists also focused on the question of whose representations of disability come to matter and how. They highlighted the problematic marginality of disabled people's own depictions of themselves, compared with the fame of this piece by a non-disabled artist, the very famous Damien Hirst. So I think these 2015 responses reveal an infrastructure for thinking and talking about disability that emerged in the cultural sector and in humanities academia mostly after 2003. And this was driven by disabled people themselves, who were coming to the fore during this period as cultural actors. They were following in the footsteps of a generation of disabled activists whose struggle had brought about progress in the political and legal spheres, and they were now becoming activists in the cultural sphere and in the arts and in academia. This infrastructure for reflecting, inquiring, speaking is precious. It shouldn't be taken for granted because it's under threat at the moment with ongoing austerity in the cultural sector and in universities. This infrastructure helps us to speak back to the embedded disability narratives, like my own, which have shaped our lives. It also helps us to generate more freeing narratives of what it means to be an embodied being in the world. Thank you.
Harriet, I owe you an apology. I'm so sorry. After introducing Christy and wanting to hear what Christy had to say, I forgot that we had agreed that I was going to introduce all three speakers before Christy spoke. So I am now post hoc, and people, I think, will be really interested to hear your background following your talk. Dr. Harriet Cooper has recently joined Norwich Med School as a lecturer in medical education and was previously a lecturer in medical and health humanities in the School of Art, Media and American Studies at UEA. She's an interdisciplinary researcher who holds a PhD in critical medical humanities from Birkbeck, University of London, and a PhD in the sociology of disability from UEA, which is an amazing thing to have two PhDs. Her book, Critical Disability Studies and the Disabled Child, Unsettling Distinctions, was published by Routledge in 2020. And then our last speaker is Sally Hardy. So Sally is the Dean of Health Sciences at UEA and a Professor of Mental Health and Practice Innovation. Sally worked at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, Australia, and returned to the UK as Head of Department for Mental Health and Learning Disabilities at City University London, where she launched the Joint Institute for Mental Health Nursing with East London Foundation Trust, and that was in 2009. And she also worked as Associate Dean there. At UEA and throughout her academic career, Sally's remained closely linked with her roots in the NHS, promoting practitioner-led inquiry and service improvements through evidence-based healthcare. That's what we all want as people who are receiving healthcare. So thank you. We look forward to hearing Sally. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. And I want to look at strategies for improving mental well-being in our workplaces, in our communities, in our society, and doing that through engaging with creative arts. I first presented this speech back in 2021 at the Care Art Basel conference, which was all about understanding and thinking about the creative arts' role as an intervention in improving health and social care. Prior to that, I was also at a mental health conference in Trinidad where we were exploring cultural, creative, heritage references to improving and understanding mental health of the Caribbean communities. Today, I want to give you a whistle-stop tour through the landscape that is a growing interest in the role of creative arts as a specific health-related intervention. I believe it's one that cuts through stigma, social hierarchy, personal prejudice to bring people together, working to further understand and purposefully promote person-centered, humane practices. As you heard, I'm a professor of mental health and practice innovation, so I'm always keen to think about and learn about creative solutions to complex human problems. I truly believe that engaging with creative arts, whether as a facilitated activity or as a personal singular occupation, can really help us to better understand and engage with our inner workings of our minds and bodies, enabling us to then more purposefully connect, interact with the world around us. So arts engagement can help to bring about our innermost feelings, thoughts to the surface in a process of thoughtful craft that enables us to share closely with others, individualized perspectives, with the intention of leading to improved understanding of both our inner selves and how we relate to others, and even to engage more purposefully with the world in which we inhabit. In its broadest term, creative arts can be any activity where a person is engaging with their creative exploratory self. I see this as achieved more recently through digital media and technology-driven creative expressions. When considering creative art and well-being, we engage not just with the person, but we also have to consider the context, their relational response to place, where they are undertaking their practice, seeing the place as space, a social circumstance for creative activity. Our environments influence the depth of feeling, experience, and has a dramatic impact on our well-being. Walking here this evening, looking at the grandeur of the building, coming into the auditorium, gets my heart pumping. I don't know about you. In healthcare, the identification of social prescribing is being used and recognised as an alternative to medical prescriptions as healthcare intervention. It shows how healthcare practice is accepting the need for a holistic, place-based approach to well-being, finding out and connecting people to what health restoration activity takes place from within and across our local contexts, cultures, and communities. Social prescribing is identified as an activity or a series of activities that helps people connect, whether that is in their local community, maximizing the benefits of a chosen creative activity, plus offering a chance to exchange through encounters with purpose. So historically, art as a means of self-expression has occurred through the use of imagery. Perhaps we are all familiar with the cave drawings. Art or image making has always been used as a communication tool to explore and explain humankind, our interactions and understanding of our place in the world, our relationships with other natural beings that share our world, as you can see here. Cave art has been found on many stone carvings depicting figurines, but has also been found on the developing creation of functional pieces, for example, pottery, that we now explore as a way of understanding social beings coming together, eating and communicating. We are perhaps all more familiar with the historical evidence of the use of stained glass, such as those found in churches, monasteries. Some of the oldest are still available to be seen in France, dating back to 675 AD, where the coloured glazed windows tell the biblical stories and were used as an opportunity for community interaction and knowledge exchange. When people couldn't read words on a page, imagery was used to enable people to understand, explore, and engage in the external world, a bigger world than their local community. Through pictorial offerings, bringing alive aspects of the storytelling, engaging the visual elements of the mind, the imagination, with the spoken word through visual image. One of my personal interests is exploring what's known as the art of the insane. In the development of psychiatry as a specialist field of medicine back in the late 18th, early 19th century, it tended towards an understanding of madness could be achieved through allowing patients self-expression through artistic activity. With psychiatry came the emergence of asylums, specifically created to encase and to care for the insane, leading perhaps in itself a disappearance of those artists from their local communities, a different form of asylum. The relentless confrontation of the unconscious and the inner world of the mind posed fundamental questions for psychiatrists and artists alike. Yet madness was removed from its community, where perhaps that very artistry could have helped people understand expression in all its forms. Perhaps this is an early warning sign of how the dominant discourses of the modern world can seek to control freedom of expression. However, interest remains across all fields of interdisciplinary inquiry and raises new modes of research, as artistic expression provides many worthy areas of investigation and insights into our changing understanding and societal perceptions of mental and physical illness and wellness. Today, as you've heard, there's a resurgence in interest in medical and health humanity programs that are increasing in popularity as we are encouraged to pay attention, to observe, to seek meaning through creative expression. Moving into the early 21st century, interest turns to the non-medical causes of non-communicable diseases and their unequal distribution within and between different societies, within which we can, this evening, start to acknowledge and address and look again to creatively explore what the options are together. As part of this consideration of health and well-being, instances are given of the arts contributing to improved environments. If you think about the urban regeneration of the 60s and 70s and the garden cities that are emerging today, plus how whole communities are being helped to overcome distress and disaster through restoration art projects. Arts engagement can be envisaged as a factor that can mitigate the effects of health inequalities, while policies are there, we hope, to eradicate their causes. And yet, as this slide says, there is a need still for a more holistic approach to health, which promotes social inclusion. The arts may be one of the interagency approaches that can be viewed as important in redressing social and health inequalities. So today, we are looking at creative arts as a new mode of treatment. I've talked about social prescribing, I've talked about creative arts and health, and there is now talk of planetary health, where we engage with hard-to-reach communities in their context, in their social environment, and also consider the impact of climate change and how to address climate change through artistic expression. And there is a big movement about the positivity of having art in hospitals. The research shows that even if you have an image of nature on the wall when you're in hospital, your recovery rate can increase 20%. And as you've heard today, COVID has brought out many of our internal staff's talents and desire to remain humanly connected despite layers and layers of protective equipment. One of the projects we engaged in at UEA with our partners at Norwich University of Arts was the Centenary of Caring project, where we linked up our students with the art students to explore their experiences. And some of that artwork you've already seen this evening and is also on the website. So I would encourage you to observe, look, and engage with that online exhibition. One of the areas that was involved was an old people's home, and the art was a performance piece, and there was a member of staff that had been away for a while self-isolating, and when they came back, they said, the atmosphere is different, what's happened? And we think it was because the residents were involved in this creative performance. They had a collective experience together that changed the atmosphere. So moving now to the impact and implications of engaging with creative arts. As I've said, it transcends social prejudice, stigma, and hierarchies. The Social Prescribing Network has identified the potential of social prescribing as a catalyst for creating communities that strengthen their own ability to care for themselves, but also for each other. The Rotherham CCG project identified a threefold return on investment, equivalent to £3.38 for every pound spent over a 5-year period because of a creative arts programme. So as I finish, what is the essentials that creative freedom can bring? Allow it people to descend into their own darkness in search of themselves, the risk is for medical and health in the humanities to perhaps become a formulaic in its approach to implementation. What I'm keen to consider and embrace is the continual changing landscape of self-expression as we continue to look, learn, see, hear, and explore the efficacy of creative arts engagement on health and well-being. Thank you.
So we're now going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. And starting off, are there any questions in the room? Fantastic.
Yes.
You talked about, oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
You talked about research, sort of cutting-edge research being led in the US. Do you think, I mean, I love our NHS, but do you think that's partly driven by private healthcare in the US, driving people to demand that? And second question, I guess, we tend to follow Americans, you know, coffee shops boom over here, cheap air travel. Do you think that's a natural progression in that we often follow US leadership?
Yeah, I've wondered about that. So certainly in terms of narrative medicine, they're way ahead of we are. But I feel like obviously a completely different structure, completely different system of training doctors, completely different system of training all health professionals in the UK and the US. But I do feel like in terms of where we're at now, people in government are looking very carefully about what to do. And it seems to me that narrative medicine is only one, but it's one answer to lots of different questions that we have in the UK. Question number one, how do we support clinician mental health? One answer, narrative medicine. Question two, how do we improve patient satisfaction? Narrative medicine. So there's lots and lots of different questions that feel quite urgent in the UK that are being driven by Parliament, that the term narrative medicine is coming up a lot, I think. But yeah, we do tend to. I don't know in medicine if we often follow America, but you're right with the coffee, and thank goodness for that. One good thing. But thank you for the question.
Sally, I wonder if you wanted to comment just for a minute about Australia, because I know you've got quite a lot of experience there.
In terms of Indigenous health, I think there has been considerable shift in perspectives and also in Canada, actually, utilising heritage and understanding cultural heritage as a way of community health and well-being. And I think in Australia, one of the things that they have really grabbed, because basically they've got such a massive landmass, is the potential that digital health brings and the exposure that people can have to utilising the digital technologies and exploring not just the imagery, the sound, the way that those sorts of movements can bring us together and bring new understanding to whole swathes of work that perhaps we've overlooked in the past.
I think that's it. I think, you know, the pandemic has uncovered the other pandemics that had always existed around the world. So when we think about racism, ageism, violence against women, all those things that had existed already, what it's done is it's opened everyone's eyes to it.
Yes.
And so the subjects that deal with that is medical humanities.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've got thoughts about that, Harriet, as well.
I was just thinking, I think there's a special word for that, isn't there? The syndemic, the concept of the kind of two pandemics running alongside each other, whereby there's an intersection between the COVID-19 pandemic and then health inequities.
Absolutely. They've been, they, as you say, that they have been made so apparent through the pandemic. Any other questions in the room? Yes, to the gentleman there. Thank you.
Not really a question. I was just wondering whether this Damien Hirst sculpture is still exhibited.
Harriet.
Oh, the Damien Hirst sculpture? I don't think so. I think it was part of a temporary exhibition called Sculpture in the City. So I think there were lots of different massive sculptures in this 2015 sort of sculpture park around the City of London. And obviously it was displayed in 2003 outside the White Cube at that time because that was a Damien Hirst exhibition. But I don't think it's currently displayed. Yeah, I would like to go and see it if it were, well, just because I'm interested for research, really. But no, I don't think it's currently displayed.
Hello, thank you very much for your amazing talks. I was just interested in the, I suppose at the moment, like you were talking about narrative medicine and that it's the concept of integrating it into our current healthcare system. At the moment, I think doctors come into their practice absolutely terrified of the senior people and of the senior clinicians that they're working for. So how do you start to integrate that change from the bottom up? I suppose because the examples you were giving of creativity within healthcare were coming from the nurses or the allied health professionals. Would you say as well from doctors as well? Amazing.
Yeah. No, that was the doctors, actually.
Rita Chiron is a doctor.
Because from my experience, I've not seen it so much from the doctor's side. And the creativity in intensive care often comes from the nurses, the playing of the music, the pictures, like you say, behind the bed space. And is there this fear, I suppose, of the of their senior clinicians in trying to integrate narrative medicine within the healthcare, and how long do you think it will take to sort of start to integrate that creativity? Is it something like with all research, they say it's about a 12-year cycle to get your research actually embedded in the workplace? I'm just quite interested to hear your thoughts.
I think it feels very urgent and in terms of what's happening in Parliament and those urgent questions that they've got to answer very, very rapidly. But also there has, I think, anecdotally, there's been a shift in people like my colleague who used to call my subject woo-woo into actually saying, look, we're on our knees now, we're desperate. I've got another friend who's a GP who said people are coming in, they're suffering existentially. There's nothing I can prescribe for that. And I don't know how to treat that. And I'm going home with these just suffering. And so I think that the way to do it is to make it compulsory as part of all medical training and nurse training. But I mean, that feels like a very radical thing. That would be my ambition. I don't know if I'll ever see it in my lifetime, but it feels like if it has to be that level of kind of commitment from people, because not only are the patients suffering beyond belief, but actually the clinicians are really, really struggling and suffering. And I'm sure you've got thoughts about that as well.
And I think, as I've tried to explain, the evidence base is now really beginning to show the significance of what might seem a soft science or a simple act of kindness, to borrow your phrase, that really does shift a dynamic and a relationship and a culture in the workplace. And my example with the residential care home, it was tangible, the difference, just because they had engaged in a slightly different intervention and they were laughing together and they were throwing paintballs at the word COVID and just letting out all their rage, and created this fantastic multicoloured poster. And it shifted the dynamic, and it really does, you can't help but get excited by that, and it is infectious and contagious for all the right reasons. And you only need a few people doing small acts, and it soon sweeps all the way through what is, as we've heard and as we know, an incredibly stressful environment in the NHS right now.
And I think in terms of what we can do in clinical practice, because people are so overworked at the moment. There was a sign-up sheet for yoga and wellness on one of the wards that I visited, and somebody had written, "I didn't pee for 12 hours yesterday, namaste." So, I mean, the reality is it has to come in training, because once people are out there, they are in a situation that they're not equipped for, really.
But training for the managers as well, right? Because they're the ones that are implementing the yoga.
Absolutely.
And it feels tokenistic, like we've got a new wellbeing hub, and it's one that the people that are really worked off their feet, they can never go to.
Yeah.
So there's not that access and availability for these things that will facilitate the health and well-being of the staff.
Yeah.
So if the managers had that training too, that would just be really
I think that's
crucial.
great. And another thing which is happening in the US is that they have a chief wellbeing officer, and that is a board level appointment with the budget to go with it. And very often wellbeing in the NHS is given to a very bright, very overworked nurse with no budget and no place on the main board. And so the model in the States is giving them the same status as the chief finance officer and the head of HR. And that's a really important shift, I think, that we can learn from the US.
And Caroline's worked exclusively with doctors in psychotherapy for how many years?
Well, about 20.
20 years. And I mean, you can attest that we have a major urgent crisis on our hands. So these things might sound a bit strange or unusual, but we have to do something.
Are there any other questions? Oh, lots. Can we have one over the one there?
Hi.
Yeah, we'll take a few questions together, and if we can, because the time is pressing on, if we can keep them quite short, that would be great.
I just want to, sorry, hi, it's more of a comment, but partly a question. I've been treating people homeopathically for 25 years, and it started out as my subject being called a woo-woo, and still is by a lot of people, and people only go to homeopaths because they're the worried well.
I don't want to be rude, but can we have the question, please?
It's more of a comment to say that I have had doctors and dentists and people coming to me who have changed their opinion, and they are actually coming and seeking counselling and help now, and whereas before they weren't, before they would just dismiss it. So it's more of a comment, but sorry, it's not really a question.
Thank you, that's very helpful. There's a question behind, and we'll have a couple of questions that.
Briefly to Professor Christie. So you mentioned a word that I have heard a lot over the last 2 years, but you don't like it at all, resilience.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could just say a little more about that.
Okay, so comments on resilience.
Yeah.
And a very quick question to Sally. Fascinated by the use of art as a form of therapy for both mental health and physical health. And my question is whether there's been any work on if a patient selects their own art versus having the art imposed is the wrong word, selected for them. So is there one might imagine that if the patient perhaps shows their own art forms and their own art, they might recover more quickly. But I wondered if that was really true.
That's very interesting. And third question? Yes, over.
Thank you very much for your enlightening talks. It is all about us and us, but aren't you going to have to prove that you're going to save money by doing this in order to get noticed?
Okay. Okay.
Good question.
So we've got 3 questions here. We've got resilience, and I imagine all 3 of you may have views on that. A fascinating question about whether there's a difference if the art is selected for the patient or the patient selects the art. And then that question of Mula, whether you are going to have to prove whether you're going to have to prove that it's cost effective. Harriet, do you have views on resilience?
Yeah, I suppose these debates interest me a great deal, and I suppose one of the things that I always feel
is the need for a kind of structural analysis that positions resilience within a wider cultural context and understands the sense in which the NHS is on its knees, as we've been discussing, and the idea that resilience makes something a problem of the individual, whereas a different concept might help us to understand it as a structural issue, as in how could anyone cope if their workload is the workload of 5 people, I suppose. So that would be why I think I would also slightly balk at the concept of resilience, or at least want to kind of open it up for questioning. Yeah.
Sally, do you want to add anything to that?
To the word resilience?
Yeah.
Staff hate the word, don't they? And being told to be more resilient, it's just an absolute no-no for people right now who, as we've talked about, are on their knees. Yeah. It's about what can I do with you and for you, not it's your, you're suffering somehow because you're not resilient enough. So the word is going out of fashion fast.
Good. The question of art, the question about who is choosing the art.
So there is quite a lot of neuroscience now around arts engagement, and by the word arts, it can be gardening, it can be knitting, it can be poetry. It's absolutely about self-expression. And you're right, if people are allowed the space to reflect and spend time understanding themselves and how they relate to those around them, yes, there is a wellbeing improvement. 10 minutes in a green space has a positive effect on our well-being.
Thank you.
I'm going to get the money question, aren't I?
No, that's fine.
I'll give it a go.
I'm going to put it to the others
because
too.
I do talk about this a lot with policymakers. And actually, I had a conversation with a politician recently who suggested that the idea of narrative medicine and medical humanities and embedding that in training is actually fiscally attractive. So, I mean, I just thought that was a beautiful phrase in itself, and I thought about that phrase as fiscally attractive, because essentially it doesn't cost the Treasury much, really, at all. And it answers all those questions. And at the moment, people are being held account to answer all those questions. How are we going to level up? How are we going to deal with the problem of mental health clinicians leaving, retention, not just recruitment, but retention? All those big questions that need answering at the moment, it's one answer. And it's actually, compared to all the other answers, probably the cheapest answer. So,
do you want to add?
Well, again, I touched on it very briefly in my talk that research into social prescribing is finding a 3-fold investment in any pound spent. Initially, there's investment that's needed, but over a period of time, the net worth is a 3-fold improvement. We are seeing people no longer being on that conveyor belt cycle of keep going back to the GP, asking those existential questions. There is improvement, and there is a whole team of people looking at the cost effectiveness of alternative and holistic approaches to health and well-being.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Harriet? You don't?
I don't. That's probably not my area.
That's not your
but
bag. I'm aware that are there any questions, online questions, that we should be asking?
I think there was a lady up here with a question.
Yeah, with the microphone.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take the lady there and then see if there are any online questions. But the lady there, yeah.
It's just coming
down. It's just coming down.
I would have thought it was very important at the same time to train senior doctors in narrative health, because my sister-in-law is a doctor and she got blasted every now and then for showing humanity. And then you find out that in the GP's practice, I've seen some awful things happening which just shouldn't be happening. And they're not, so you're talking about GPs, and then there's people I've known who've given up medicine because they've just found it too much.
Yeah.
And what's the point?
Thank you.
Thank you. Tanner, are there some online questions?
Yeah. So someone has asked, how do we find out more about the upcoming MA?
Oh, that's
Great question.
So, Harriet, you can answer that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to be the course director for the MA, and Christy's going to be teaching on it. And
My woo-woo subject.
we're producing documentation for the website at the moment. So I think it will be online in the next probably couple of months. People are welcome to contact me with inquiries.
We're hoping, well, we will launch next year, hopefully. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you that, but I've told you so.
Yeah, the hope is to launch in September 2023. So yes, you have a bit of time to think about it and get applying.
Fantastic. And any other online questions?
Thank you very much for the wonderful talks. And Dr. Cooper, I was deeply moved by your talk about representation of disabilities. And my question is, how does it relate to invisible disabilities? How do they get portrayed?
Good. Fantastic question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've thought quite a lot about passing as non-disabled, because I think in some contexts I can pass as non-disabled, and in other contexts people do perceive that there's something just very slightly different about my body maybe. So I've always felt that I'm never quite sure which side of the line I define myself, and sort of feel quite uncomfortable either in the disability category or in the non-disabled category as well. But I think that invisible disabilities are a really complex area as well. Perhaps it would be great to have a chat with you over a glass of wine.
And I think that's a great question and a great point.
Good cue.
And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. 3 fantastic speakers, Christy, Sally, Harriet, and there will be an opportunity to talk to the speakers afterwards.
Okay, so it draws to me to close this evening, but thank you very much for joining us for what I think has been a wonderful and very engaging evening. And I want to add my thanks as well. Thank you to Caroline for chairing this evening, but thank you also to my amazing colleagues. I'm so privileged to have this job and get to work with such amazing people day in and day out in my role at UEA. So thank you to Christy, Sally and Harriet for sharing their stories, their creativity and their research with us this evening. I'd also like to thank UEA graduate and junior doctor at the Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital, Dr. Lena Ibrahim, who is with us this evening. She's allowed us to use her original artwork for the promotion of this event. And for those of you joining in person, some of her artwork is on display in the room next door. I think you'll agree that it's amazing work, and Lena comes home from a busy shift, and this is her way of unwinding after that. So thank you for those of you who've joined us remotely, and to our London audience, please do join us for some drinks in the library next door. Thank you and good night.